Schultz. A little background, he has lived in Boxford for over 20 years with his wife Susan and 2 children. He's always lived in New England. In his background, he was a history major at Brown University. He has an MBA from Harvard. He's currently a CEO at Sassenach company, which is a part of United Technologies, and they're located over in the Cummings Center. His avocation is really history, and he's put together I think you'll find a very interesting program on the history and marketing of King Philip. Incidentally, he does have a book available here for sale. I didn't just find mine. On King Philip's War. It's a result of all the research that he's done, and you'll hear most of that, or a good part of it tonight. Tonight he can autograph it for you. It sells for $15, so after the presentation, if anyone is interested, look up Eric. And beyond that, Eric Schultz, all yours.
I'm going to have nightmares tonight about my computer sliding off the screen. Is it too cold?
It's too cold.
Okay. First of all, thanks. You couldn't ask for a nicer place to speak, at least for this kind of a talk, than this facility. This is beautiful. I know it's competitive tonight. The Sox are playing. The Yankees. I know that. I have no doubt that they'll win tonight. You won't have to worry about the rest of the series. Also, it's I think there's a mascot football game, and it's the end of the first week of school. So those of you who have children know what that's like. It's chaos. The first week at Masco, we have 3 at Masco. We have 3 at Masco. The first week they come home and you say, do you have homework? And they say yes. And they hand it all to you because it's all the forms and things you have to fill out in that first week. So it's your homework. Last Friday night, all of them are here. Most of them are here. Our book group met. And the only reason I mention that, we did Middlesex, by the way, which is an interesting book. But the reason I mention that is because one of the wits in our book club said, why don't you call this King Philip's War on the North Shore? The only problem would be he wasn't a king, his real name wasn't Philip. It wasn't much of a war, and nothing happened on the North Shore. So I'm here to confirm some of those and actually to tell you that some of those things aren't true. What we'll do tonight is we'll talk about the war, but just glance across some of the key events. There's a lot more in the book. And then I want to do a section on the marketing of King Philip and the way he goes from being sort of demonized to romanticized to commercialized, what we do to the Native Americans in the country. So 2 parts to it. I'm figuring maybe 40 minutes, maybe 50 if we get rolling. I don't think it'll be an hour. So here's the North Shore, and let's start with King Philip. He wasn't a king, he was a sachem, okay? And his name was Metacom. He was Massasoit's son. He was the brother of Wampsut. And when Massasoit dies, 1661, Metacom and Wampsut petitioned the English court for English names. I think it's easier to transact business, it's a sign of respect, and they're given Philip and Alexander. Alexander's the older brother, and I'll show you a genealogy, a quick chart in a minute. But hence, and during the war, the English start to call him king, because they don't have a better term, but he was a sachem. And sachems had some of the rights and responsibilities of kings, but the problem that they had is they had to make good decisions for their people. If they didn't, they weren't followed. And you'll see that in the war. The sachems have a very difficult time delivering their people to Philip to fight for Philip or delivering them to the English. They're split. It's a very interesting thing that happens. It was a small war. It was a short war. It started in June of 1675 and went through the following August of 1676 when Philip was killed in Bristol, Rhode Island. But following King Philip's War came Prince William's War, which was also known as the War of the League of Augsburg. Following that came Queen Anne's War, which was the War of Spanish Succession, and then King George's War, which is the War of Austrian Succession on the continent, ending with the French and Indian War. So it was really the kickoff to 100 years of warfare, which would establish who owned the land. And it wasn't the Dutch, and it wasn't the French, and in the beginning it wasn't the Native Americans. Turned out to be England. But that was the series they got, and then up to the Revolution. Now, about the North Shore, a couple of things you should know. First of all, William Hubbard, the Reverend William Hubbard, Hubbard was the minister in Ipswich. This is the map from his book. He wrote the history of King Philip's War. He was a contemporary of all of the soldiers, and he did the best single version of the war. He's a Puritan minister, so you get the Puritan angle on everything. He's racing Increase Mather, who's the minister in Boston. They're both writing histories, and there's only one printer in the colonies. Okay? Mather wins. Mather is Cotton's father. Minister of Boston. He wins the race, but his history's not as good. He skimped to get to the printer. So Hubbard is the guy, and his house is marked when you ride into Ipswich. Samuel Appleton was his neighbor. Appleton Farms. I think the oldest continuing operating farm in the United States. Right in Ipswich. It's just gone over to the trustees of the reservation. Held in the Appleton family for, you may know, 12 or 13 generations. Samuel Appleton turned out to be the most important English commander of the war. And he was neighbors with Hubbard. Now those two things may have a relationship, since your best friend is writing about the war. But Appleton went out to the Connecticut Valley early in the war to secure places like Springfield and Hadley and Hatfield that were under attack. So Appleton's important, North Shore guy. We'll talk about Bloody Brook. And Bloody Brook was basically one of the major battles of the war in South Deerfield, and the soldiers were all from Essex County. Salem, Beverly area, and I'll list the names for you if any of you are genealogists coming up in a minute. We'll talk about Bloody Brook. And then there's a Brocklebank who fought in the war. He was second in command at the Sudbury fight, and there's a monument to him now in Sudbury. That was one of the natives' most devastating victories over the English. So it wasn't a good result, but there is a Brocklebank house now in Georgetown, which is the Historical Society. And also, because this was a relatively safe place, many of the families from other parts of the colonies were sent here. Soldiers, farmers who became soldiers would send their families to the North Shore to sort of wait out the war because it was relatively safe. There was a little bit of violence here. Okay, there was a Narragansett by the name of Simon the Yankee Killer. If I ever write a novel, I'm going to have a Simon the Yankee Killer. That's a good name for this weekend, no? He was fleeing through the North Shore, headed to fight with the Maine Indians, the Abenaki, and then onward to Canada. And he stopped in Haverhill and attacked a young man and killed a young man named Ephraim Kingsbury. I don't know if that's in anyone's genealogy. And the same day they went over to Thomas Kimball's house, which was in Bradford, which was part of Raleigh at the time. And they burned that. Kimball was killed, and his wife and 5 children were taken captive and sent north. So there was a little bit of violence here as well. So the North Shore did participate in King Philip's War in some important ways. I wanted to go over some of the recent literature. The top, this is Jill Lepore's book, probably the one that's gotten the most press, published in 1998, The Origin of War. That came out of her Yale thesis. She's a teacher now at, I think, BU. Drake wrote about King Philip's War as kind of a civil war in 2000. One of the most interesting events just before the war is the trial of John Sassenach, who was convicted of murdering one of Philip's aides. And that happened in Plymouth. That's what Igniting King Philip's War is about. And most recently, Jenny Hill Pulsifer wrote Subjects Unto the Same King. And then, of course, the one that's gotten, because it was a national bestseller, is Nat Philbrick's book, The Mayflower, half of which is really devoted to King Philip's War. And I did want to, Nat's first book, I think this was his first book, is about the Native American legacy on Nantucket. It's called Abram's Eyes. So if you like Mayflower and you're interested in Native American, this is a very good book. Our book was published in 1999. My co-author is Mike Togus. If you haven't seen Michael Togus speaks all the time. He's like a one-man marketing machine. He's written books on canoeing the Taunton River, canoeing the Connecticut River, walks and rambles throughout New England. And he wrote, and I need to do this one, these 2 books, 10 Hours Till Dawn, which was about the Camden, which was caught in the blizzard of '78, and his most recent one, which is Fatal Forecast. Both take place right offshore here. So interesting books from Mike, and you can get those on Amazon or so you can tell Mike I plugged his books, I won't get into it. This started as a travel log. The idea was King Philip's War happened all over New England, but nobody knew about it, or didn't seem to know about it. So I set out to map it, to photograph it, to meet with local historians, and local town historians are one of the national treasures. Each town has one. They know so much about the individual town. They can take you to the library and show you the PhD thesis that was written in 1913 about the event, the only copy known. The issue with local historians is, as I say, they're 2 inches wide and 5 miles deep. Just to say, you're in Swansea, and they know all about Swansea, and you say, over in Somerset, didn't that happen? They'll say, Somerset? What would I know about Somerset? You got to go see the person in Somerset. So in order to connect the whole thing together, you need to meet with all of them. So it's a great fun to go out and meet the local historians, look at the literature that only existed in one place, and start to put together the story of the war. The problem, of course, with the war is that you only get one perspective. You only get the English perspective, and you only really get the Puritan English perspective. There are some merchants who are writing, and trade is completely torn apart, so they're mad. So they're writing back to England saying, these bureaucrats you have here, the Winslows and the Leverets, are making a mess of this. They can't control the local population. So you get that perspective, but you get no Native American perspective. Very little. There's one place where we meet Phillip. There's a speech that Phillip supposedly gave. But for the most part, it would be like writing a history of the Civil War and not having anything from the South. No literature, no histories, no public documents, nothing. And you've got to try to put together a story of the war that's fair to both sides without having both sides represented. To give you a sense, King Philip's War was fought 50 years after the Mayflower landed and 100 years before the American Revolution. So there were 50 years of peace. The English are weak, the Native Americans are weak. One of the things that shapes the war is disease. For the 100 years before the war, the natives have been trading with the English. They've been coming into places like Narragansett Bay, and they've been trading ships, and they've been delivering things like smallpox, as well as good. And historians believe today that perhaps 90% of the Native American population died because of disease prior to the war. So we think there were maybe 20,000 natives in southern New England at the time of the war, down from what would have been 200,000. So it really shaped the war. And the other thing that happens, of course, is that, and you'll see this later, Philip is a demon during the war, but after the American Revolution, people have a different sense for what Philip was doing. He was fighting for his land, he was fighting against an aggressive outsider, and all of a sudden, things start to change for his image. Lots of causes. Religion, the English were in proselytizing. It was a big problem for the natives because it was drawing away their young men. Guns, for a time it was supposed to be illegal for natives to buy and own guns. Nobody paid attention. Alcohol, the law, the Sunday laws, the natives were held accountable for what was going on the Sabbath. Disrupted trade, the Great Migration. As you know, starting when things start to settle down here in the 1630s, the English start flooding over, and they call it the Great Migration. And there was also a baby boom. As things stabilized, people had more babies. You know, if you do genealogy, there are families with 8, 10, 12 children. They didn't all make it, into adolescence, but a lot of them did. And of course, land. Pilgrims land in Plymouth in 1621. In 1623, they were already pushing into Duxbury. There were no people here yet, and they had already moved out of Plymouth into Duxbury. The draw of land was so powerful. And that's, of course, what it turned out to be about, more than anything. The English start creating towns. They start bumping into the homeland of the Native American administration. This is a map which shows you sort of where the major Native American tribes are. The Wampanoag, of course, are important. Pokanoket, which were Philip's people. They lived in Bristol and Warner Island. The Pocasset in Fall River and Tiverton. And the Sakonnet in Little Consett. And then the Nipmuc in Central Mass, around Worcester in that area. The Narragansett, which were considered the most powerful, the largest and most powerful, they contributed the most warriors. The Mohegan, who fought on the side of the English, you know what their payback was 300 years later. And the Mohawk, who were in New York. They were dreaded enemies of the Algonquin. And they made incursions over a period of close to 20 years in what was called the Mohawk War. So you have the Wampanoag sort of stuck in the middle with an eastern front fighting the English and a western front fighting the Mohawk. This is Philip's family tree. Massasoit, whose native name was Usamiquin. Massasoit means great or grand sachem. He had at least 4